April 7, 1945, East China Sea. Beneath low thunderclouds, oxygen hiss from ruptured lines. The wind carried the scent of burning fuel and brine, and from the command deck of the Yamato men could already feel the vibration, through the soles of their boots, a deep, steady tremor, like the heartbeat of something too vast to live. The sea, gray and flat, mirrored the sky so perfectly that the horizon seemed to dissolve. In that indistinct space, Japan's last Leviathan moved toward her own extinction. She was the pride of a fading empire. 72,000 tons of steel, 9 18.1-inch guns, and armor thick enough to repel any shell then known to man. They called her unsinkable. But the very idea of unsinkable was about to meet the cold arithmetic of air power. From the moment she left Tokuyama, American reconnaissance had already drawn invisible crosshairs over her course, and above the cloud ceiling, U.S. Task Force 58 had readied more than 380 aircraft. The mechanism of her destruction would not be a duel of guns, but a flood of motion, a tempo so fast no human eye could trace it. The first radar blips came at 100 miles. Then came the voices, clipped, calm, procedural. Yamato bearing confirmed. The crew below heard none of it, only the rising hum of turbines, the groan of watertight doors, the metallic rhythm that pulsed like a warning through her ribs. In the radio shack, a young ensign whispered, "The ocean is too small for gods this size." He was 19. The air assault would close at nearly 300 miles per hour. Torpedoes calibrated to strike just beneath the armored belt. Bombs plunging at 70 degrees from 15,000 feet. Every second would count, every knot, every gallon of fuel, every heartbeat measured against a rain of steel and fire. For all her mass, the Yamato would be undone by geometry and speed, by weapons launched miles beyond her reach. Below decks, engineers braced by the engines felt that same oxygen hiss, sharp, rhythmic, alive. It was the sound of the machine breathing, unaware it was already dying. By dusk, one ship would vanish beneath the waves, and the myth of the unsinkable would die with her. What followed was not a battle, but an autopsy written in flame and salt water. The roots of Yamato's destruction were sown long before the first bomb ever fell. In the halls of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Naval General Staff doctrine had hardened into faith in the decisive battle, the idea that one perfect clash between mighty fleets could restore balance and erase humiliation. Every blueprint, every ton of steel poured into the Yamato was built around that single belief that mass and armor could offset the loss of reach. For years, admirals clung to it even as their airfields burned and their carriers sank. By 1945, the war had already changed shape. The Americans no longer sought duels, they sought annihilation by tempo. Carrier task groups moved in coordinated waves, refueling and rearming at sea, launching fresh squadrons every 40 minutes. A single U.S. task force could deliver more explosive weight in 1 hour than the Yamato's entire main battery could in a day. It was an equation that rendered the old Japanese dream of symmetrical battle obsolete. Yet still the High Command ordered her out, not as strategy, but as symbol. Her mission, codenamed Operation Tengo, was almost suicidal from the start. With less than 2,000 tons of fuel, barely enough for a one-way journey to Okinawa, she was to run south at flank speed, ground herself on the beaches, and become a static fortress against the American landings. It was an echo of medieval sacrifice, steel, replacing flesh duty, replacing reason. The battleship must not return, read the order from Tokyo. It was signed with the same conviction that once built her. Inside the ship, men understood. Lieutenant Commander Yoshida, executive officer, later recalled the silence that followed the briefing. "We knew the fuel would not bring us home," he wrote. Still, no one spoke of surrender. The Yamato's engines burned at 12,000 horsepower per shaft, consuming over 100 tons of fuel per hour. Her speed could touch 27 knots, but at that rate her endurance shrank to a matter of hours. For every mile forward she burned another fraction of her future. Across the Pacific, the Americans watched with clinical detachment. Their reconnaissance network submarines, aircraft radio decrypts had already mapped the Japanese fleet's every movement. The Yamato was not a ghost, but a coordinate. Her size, once a deterrent, now made her a beacon. "She's a target too big to miss," a U.S. radar operator wrote in his log that morning. To the men of Task Force 58, this was not an act of valor to be matched, but a system to be dismantled. The Yamato doctrine had always been a mirror of Japan's wartime psychology, an obsession with honor form and absolute acts of will. It believed in singular perfection, the one ship, the one sword stroke over the messy arithmetic of logistics. The Americans believed in the opposite. Their fleet was a swarm, modular, replaceable, synchronized. While Yamato's guns could hurl a 1-ton shell 26 miles, the carriers could project destruction 300 miles beyond the horizon. Her engineers had mastered metallurgy, but not tempo. It was not a failure of courage. The men aboard Yamato were sailors of astonishing discipline. They drilled gunnery teams to reload the 18.1-inch guns in less than a minute, 72 seconds of sweat and thunder. They maintained radar rangefinders with tolerances measured in fractions of a degree. Yet the larger rhythm of war had outpaced them. For every shell they could fire, the Americans launched dozens of aircraft. For every man they trained, the U.S. Navy trained 20. "Don't build fortresses," one American analyst later wrote. "Build motion." It was the law of modern war. Whoever moved faster, thought faster, replaced faster, would survive. The Japanese believed armor could substitute for adaptability. They learned too late that armor merely delays time. It never stops it. As Yamato steamed south her escorts, the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers formed a loose screen around her hull like fish circling a whale. Their radar was primitive, their air cover non-existent. The sky over Kyushu was already alive with contrails. The pilots of the U.S. carriers Essex, Bunker Hill, and Bennington read the same weather sheets, the same intercept data. By noon, they would fill that same sky with more than 150 dive bombers and 130 torpedo planes. From the bridge, Captain Aruga peered through his binoculars and saw only rain squalls. He was 52 years old, stoic and steady, the last of a generation that had grown up with Togo's victory at Tsushima as gospel. "If we must die," he told his crew, "we will die as warriors." The men saluted not out of fanaticism, but ritual. They had been raised to see death as duty, and duty as the only escape from defeat. The sound of the engines, that low, rhythmic hum of turbines and oxygen hiss, filled the corridors again. It was the pulse of inevitability. They were not just sailing to Okinawa. They were sailing into history's verdict. The logic of mass and armor born from an earlier age would soon face the geometry of air and light. Beyond the rain line, the first American pilots were already descending through the clouds, their bomb racks armed, their torpedo sights locked. In less than an hour, they would see her silhouette cut through the mist, the last giant of the sea, still believing she could not be sunk. And when the first wave struck the doctrine itself, not just the ship would begin to break apart. The morning of April 7th began deceptively calm. The East China Sea was a mirror of gray, a plane of stillness hiding a network of coordinates, vectors, and silent signals. Aboard Yamato, the crew clung to their duties with the mechanical precision of men who had accepted their fate. In the boiler rooms, firemen shoveled fuel at a rhythm that no longer measured life but defiance. The turbines screamed at 150 revolutions per minute, pushing the great hull southward 25 knots against a wall of invisible enemies. The first lesson of modern war was about to arrive. Weight and courage could not outrun information. U.S. submarines Threadfin and Hackleback had already spotted the task group hours earlier, radioing its position to Task Force 58. Above them, radar-equipped Avengers and Hellcats scanned the weather breaks, triangulating reflections. The geometry of air power had no mercy for myths. When the first American strike group appeared 280 aircraft strong, they did not come as heroes or hunters. They came as engineers of probability. Every squadron had precise timing, 15 minutes between waves, attack angles calculated to overload the Japanese anti-aircraft arcs. At 12:20 p.m., lookouts aboard Yamato reported black specks rising from the southern horizon. Then the sky began to hum. The sound grew, not thunder, not wind, but the collective growl of engines synchronized in lethal symmetry. Captain Aruga ordered full alert. The ship's massive anti-aircraft guns, 127mm dual mounts and 25mm triples, opened fire at ranges of 7,000 yards. The sea erupted in concentric rings of flak bursts of orange and white clawing at the clouds. But the gunners faced a hopeless calculus. For every shell they fired, 10 more planes entered range. Ammunition burned at a rate of 4,000 rounds per minute. The barrels glowed cherry red, the loaders' hands blistered through their gloves. The first bomb struck near turret number 3, a 1,000-pound armor piercer that tore through the upper deck before exploding deep inside the hull. The concussion rolled through the ship like a pulse of heat. Men in the forward damage control station were thrown from their posts. The watertight compartments held for now. "Don't seal yet," an officer shouted. "Men are still inside." It was the last order he gave. Within 10 minutes, torpedo planes closed from both flanks. The Americans had learned from earlier battles they attacked in crossfire patterns, ensuring that even a giant like Yamato could not turn fast enough to evade both sides. At least 7 torpedoes hit the port side one after another, their warheads each carrying 600 pounds of TNT. The ship listed 5 degrees, then 10. Water surged into the engine rooms. In those moments, the myth of invulnerability evaporated. Men who had once called her the floating fortress began to understand that steel was mortal too. "Don't fear the sea," one petty officer told his men, his voice trembling. "Fear silence." Minutes later, silence came. The forward generators went out, lights flickered, and communication lines died. Smoke filled the corridors, thick and hot, smelling of cordite and burned paint. Don't fight the storm, use it. That was the lesson the Americans had learned since Midway: adapt, don't endure. The Yamato, in contrast, was designed to endure everything, even reality itself. Her systems were compartmentalized, her leadership rigid. Every decision climbed through the chain of command, while bombs fell faster than words could travel. On the carrier, Bunker Hill, a dive bomber pilot named Ensign Jack Lawton banked low to see the spectacle. "It was like striking a mountain," he wrote later. And the mountain bled fire. From 15,000 feet, he watched columns of black smoke coil upward like serpents, each explosion marking the death of another compartment. Still, the crew fought on. Gun crews remained at their posts, even as the decks burned beneath their feet. Torpedo officer Lieutenant Koyanagi continued relaying firing data despite a fractured arm. The discipline held, but it no longer mattered. Mathematics had replaced honor. At 1:15 p.m., another wave of torpedo bombers struck her port side, lifting the massive ship several feet from the water before slamming her down again. The list increased to 15 degrees. Flooding was uncontrollable. Orders came to counterflood the starboard tanks, a desperate maneuver that bought only minutes. Inside the central plotting room, Commander Yasumi recorded each hit with trembling hands. His final log entry read, 10 hits confirmed, still fighting. The Yamato's last coherent radio message was transmitted at 1:33 p.m. "Enemy planes attacking. We are engaging." Then static swallowed the line. Above her, the sky shimmered with sunlight refracting through oily smoke. In Tokyo, staff officers waited for news. When the reports came, fragmented, delayed, unbelievable, the lesson was too vast to admit. One man muttered, "The sea itself turned against us." But the truth was simpler: speed had outthought strength. Beneath the decks, men still fought fires that could not be extinguished. Steam hissed from ruptured lines, that same oxygen hiss, sharper now, frantic, echoing through dark corridors. It was the sound of a world cracking open. The Yamato had been built to define naval supremacy. Instead, she became its tombstone. As the second wave approached, her fate was sealed, yet she would not sink easily. There were still men on board who refused to leave their posts. They had not yet paid the final tuition of the Empire's dream. That payment in fire, in seconds, in human breath, was about to come due. By 1:40 p.m., the Yamato was no longer a ship in motion, but an enormous dying fortress, adrift in smoke. The sky above had turned black with oil and flame sunlight, fractured by drifting aluminum shrapnel. From a distance, the Americans circling at altitude could hardly tell if she was moving or sinking, a burning mountain, surrounded by geysers of white spray. But inside her hull, men still fought to keep the generators alive, still believed they might turn her fate by sheer will. The sound of ruptured pipes, that relentless oxygen hiss, filled the air like the rhythm of an iron lung. Then came the third wave. Torpedo bombers from Essex Langley and San Jacinto screamed out of the haze in perfect formation, banking low over the sea. They approached from port and starboard, simultaneously, a pincer of geometry, the defining tactic of the carrier war. At 300 miles per hour, they closed the distance in seconds. The Japanese guns responded in violent bursts, the ship vibrating as the 18.1-inch turrets meant for other battleships fired blind into the mist. Shells the size of cars thundered into the ocean, throwing up towers of water. But the enemy wasn't there anymore. The torpedo pilots trained through hundreds of sorties flew at barely 50 feet above the water. The American tactic was precision by saturation. Half the torpedoes targeted midship, the rest aimed for the stern, where the armor was weakest. The effect was cumulative, not immediate. Each impact tilted the ship by another degree, each explosion multiplying the flood ratio. The Yamato's ballast systems could not keep pace. At 15 degrees of list, the starboard propellers began to breach the surface, churning air instead of water. Her great speed fell from 20 knots to 10, then 5. Captain Aruga stood on the bridge, his face streaked with soot, watching tracer fire arc through the sky. "We will not strike the colors," he said simply. Behind him, the staff plotted hits on greased paper charts, though none of the markers mattered anymore. Every explosion tore another hole in the legend of invincibility. Below, men drowned in compartments that had once been the pride of engineering journals. Pumps failed, wiring burned, and ammunition detonated in sympathetic bursts, a cascade of shock and flame. At 1:58 p.m., a bomb found its mark near turret number 2. The blast penetrated deep into the powder magazine. For a moment, nothing happened, a pause as though the ship itself was inhaling. Then a column of fire tore through the deck, vaporizing steel, flesh, and air. The shockwave ripped through the hull, lifting the 72,000-ton battleship like a toy. Witnesses aboard escort destroyers later described it as an earthquake at sea, a dome of smoke rising 5 miles into the sky. Even the gods would have turned away one sailor aboard. Yahagi murmured as the flash reached their decks. In that instant, perception flipped forever. The Yamato, once the embodiment of Japan's industrial mastery, once the symbol of strength, became proof that mastery without adaptability is ruin. The Americans did not cheer. Radio chatter stayed professional, almost somber. "Primary target destroyed," one voice said flatly. Another pilot circling the scene whispered into his recorder, "She's gone." In that gray light, amid drifting oil and wreckage, the ocean seemed to exhale, an entire doctrine collapsing into bubbles and ash. At 2:05 p.m., her bow rose toward the sky, the stern disappearing beneath the waves. Thousands of men still inside felt the deck tilt sharply. Those trapped in lower compartments never had time to reach the ladders. Water filled the halls faster than they could move. Above them, gunners clung to railings as the ship rolled over completely, her underbelly flashing to the sun for a moment before the sea consumed it. Witnesses later said the sound, the groaning of steel, the thunder of imploding air pockets could be felt in the chest more than heard. For 12 minutes, the Yamato lingered upright in death, her bow pointing toward the clouds like an accusation. Then the last of her magazines detonated. The explosion registered on American radar 50 miles away. A pillar of flame shot into the sky, and when it cleared, only debris remained, twisted gun barrels burning oil and fragments of a ship that had once been a floating nation. Of the 3056 men aboard, only 269 would be rescued. The rest went down with her officers, engineers, cooks, signalmen swallowed by the pressure and darkness below. Their final moments, recorded later by survivors, were silent. No cries, no panic. Only a collective stillness as the sea claimed what hubris had built. For the Americans, the victory was clean, almost clinical. They had used 386 aircraft, dropped 700 bombs and torpedoes, and lost only 10 planes. The efficiency of destruction astonished even them. It was not courage that won. It was coordination, data timing, the invisible architecture of systems thinking. In Tokyo, news of the loss reached the high command by radio. Admiral Toyota simply nodded and said, "The fleet has performed its duty." No anger, no denial, just the realization that the Empire's last battleship had been built for a world that no longer existed. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the ocean quieted again. Oil spread across the surface like a funeral shroud. The American formation turned north, their planes landing one by one on carrier decks slick with salt spray. In the distance, faint ripples still marked where the Yamato had stood, a vanishing point of steel and fire. Down below, the sound lingered, a faint hiss, as if from oxygen escaping somewhere deep under the sea. It was the last breath of an age that believed strength was measured in armor, not in speed, and that men could command the tide by will alone. The Empire had wagered everything on the myth of the unsinkable, and the ocean had rendered its verdict. In the hours after the Yamato disappeared beneath the sea, her destruction radiated through the Imperial Navy like a seismic wave. The fleet that had once been the terror of the Pacific was now reduced to fragments and memory. For those who survived, the explosion was not just the end of a ship, it was the end of a worldview. Engineers who had worshipped armor thickness and muzzle velocity began too late to understand the arithmetic of mobility and reach. The ship was perfect, one surviving gunnery officer said bitterly, except for the world around it. The Americans, meanwhile, drew a different lesson from the wreck. From the bridges of their carriers, commanders looked down at the slick of burning oil and saw proof that doctrine could be quantified. The battle was not fought by heroes, but by algorithms of logistics. Turn rates, rearm cycles, sortie, overlap, radar feed, coordination. In the span of just 2 hours, they had erased 72,000 tons of steel with precision born from discipline, not rage. The era of individual giants had ended. The era of systems had begun. Within days, reports from Task Force 58 reached Pearl Harbor and Washington. The post-action analysis read like a manufacturing report. Attack waves launched at 11-minute intervals. Average torpedo drop speed, 130 miles per hour. Average bomb hit ratio, 35%. Not one Japanese plane had reached the carriers. The Yamato, once a masterpiece of metallurgy, had become an exhibit in the evolution of tempo. "It's not the ship," Admiral Mitsuru remarked to his staff, "it's the cycle." The Americans refined that cycle relentlessly. Every deck officer and ordnance crewman studied film footage and telemetry from the battle. Lessons were folded into new procedures, faster fueling on the hangar decks, standardized bomb lifts that cut reload time by 20%, radio brevity codes trimmed from 10 syllables to 5. Within a month, carrier groups could launch and recover twice as fast as in 1944. The rhythm of war tightened the loop between detection and strike, compressed from hours to minutes. Across the Pacific, Japan's last shipyards worked in near silence. There was no steel left to build, no fuel to launch anything new. What few destroyers remained at Kure and Sasebo were stripped for parts, their anti-aircraft guns lifted onto cliffs and beach emplacements. A generation of naval engineers stood beside empty slips, staring at the cranes that once assembled dreams. "We built strength that could not move," one shipwright later said, and called it security. The Yamato's sister ship, Musashi, had already gone down at Leyte Gulf months earlier under a similar storm of bombs and torpedoes. Her destruction had been the warning. The Yamato's was the proof. Together they marked the transition from the geometry of armor to the mathematics of networks. After Okinawa, no navy would ever again construct a battleship of that scale. Even the United States, flush with victory, canceled its planned Montana-class dreadnoughts. The lesson was irrevocable power at sea no longer came from the thickness of a hull, but from the distance a squadron could project force. From the sky, the U.S. Navy's carriers looked small flat decks floating over immense spaces, but in practice they were factories of motion. Each Essex-class ship operated like a node in a living system. 3,000 men maintaining rotation, repair, refueling, and strike planning, as though choreographed by an unseen conductor. Radar picked up targets. Fighters cleared the air. Torpedo bombers dove in clean arcs that repeated across hundreds of miles. Survivability was now measured not in inches of armor, but in how fast you could disappear and reappear somewhere else. Pilots returning from the Yamato strike were already legends before they landed. Yet their briefings were devoid of triumphalism. "She took everything we threw at her," one said. "If they'd had air cover, it might have been us sinking." The acknowledgement was quiet but real. The victory had not come from superiority of men, but superiority of system, the ability to combine intelligence, fuel, logistics, weather forecasts, and training cycles into a single pulse. Still, the destruction of Yamato carried a deeper symbolic echo. Across occupied Asia, from Singapore to the Philippines, word of her loss spread fast. For many, it marked the end of the illusion that the Japanese Empire was invincible. For others, it symbolized the tragedy of pride turned obsolete. Newspapers in Tokyo printed her final moments with solemn restraint. Yamato fought bravely. She rests beneath the southern sea. Few noticed the unspoken truth: there were no seas left for her to defend. In Washington, analysts charted curves on transparent overlays: tonnage sunk versus sortie numbers, fuel expenditure versus effect. The line was unmistakable. As the tempo increased, cost per kill dropped exponentially. The war's industrial logic had achieved full synthesis with its tactical form. What the Yamato represented, singular brilliance, had been replaced by distributed intelligence. No longer did one vessel embody a nation's strength. Now hundreds of smaller machines, guided by radar and code, did the work of gods. In the ruins of Kure, a young naval architect named Shoso Matsura wrote in his notebook, "We were defeated not by stronger weapons but by shorter intervals." That sentence would become his life's obsession. Understanding how time, not armor, ruled modern conflict. Years later, he would teach engineering students that endurance was nothing without agility. The war had taught him and the world that invincibility was an illusion measured in minutes. By May 1945, the U.S. Navy was already planning operations for the home islands, with carrier air groups trained to annihilate fleets before they ever came within sight. The Pacific had transformed into a domain of vectors and waves. The ocean no longer belonged to the largest ship, but to the fastest network. The Yamato's death was not merely an end. It was the inflection point from the age of armor to the age of integration. In the words of one pilot who flew that day, the sea didn't swallow her. The century did. And somewhere below, amid the silent, dark oxygen still leaked from ruptured tanks drifting upward in faint trails of silver, the last breath of the giant that taught the world how quickly strength can become memory. The true weapon that sank the Yamato did not roar or burn, it hummed. It was the industrial rhythm of a nation that had learned how to turn metal and motion into an unbroken loop. In 1945, the United States possessed not just carriers, but the infrastructure to keep them alive. The Yamato had been built by 3,000 men working for years. The U.S. Navy could now rebuild a damaged carrier in weeks, replace a plane in days, and train a new pilot in half that time. Beneath the Pacific battles, a far larger machine was at work, a machine made of oil, railroads, factories, and mines synchronized across an ocean. At Alameda and Pearl Harbor, the tempo was relentless. Fuel tankers ran in circuits like veins in a living body. Shipyards at Mare Island and Puget Sound worked in 24-hour shifts, welding and riveting through fog and darkness. On assembly lines from Kansas to Michigan, the same blueprints produced identical parts: engines, wings, bolts, each interchangeable, each labeled to fit anywhere in the fleet. It was interchangeability as survival. When a Hellcat went down, another took off within the hour, its pilot briefed by instructors who had flown the same pattern yesterday. Japan, by contrast, had run out of time. Allied bombing raids had shattered her railways and crippled her fuel supply. Aircraft plants at Yokosuka and Nagoya lay in ruins. Each new plane required weeks of scavenged material and hand-fitted parts. The difference was not simply material, it was systemic. American logistics operated like a conveyor of war. Japanese production still clung to craftsmanship, to the illusion that precision alone could match quantity. At Iwa Field in the Hawaiian archipelago, pilots drilled on the art of tempo. A new system called cyclic training ensured that no aircraft or man was ever idle. While one squadron practiced takeoffs, another rehearsed attack geometry, and a third studied films of actual combat. Each pilot logged between 100 and 150 flight hours per month, a number that dwarfed Japan's wartime averages. Lose 10, return 20, an instructor told his cadets, a philosophy that made replacement the truest form of endurance. Every link in the American chain reinforced the next. At Sea Fleet, oilers like USS Neosho turned refueling into choreography, connecting hoses between moving ships at 12 knots, transferring thousands of gallons in mid-motion. On land, the Bureau of Ordnance calculated every bullet fired per sortie and delivered replacements before the fleet even requested them. A damaged carrier could replenish its bomb stock overnight, its decks swarming with crews who treated aviation fuel like blood to be transfused. By the spring of 1945, the U.S. Navy averaged 200 carrier sorties per day, a pace that Japan's dwindling reserves could not imagine, much less counter. In Tokyo, engineers studied intercepted reports of this efficiency and felt disbelief. "They build war like we build poems," one technician remarked. The irony was cruel. The same meticulous craftsmanship that had produced masterpieces like Yamato had become the anchor that dragged the empire down. Each ship was a unique marvel, impossible to replace. When it died, it took irreplaceable skill with it. America's ships, by contrast, were iterations designed not as monuments, but as components in a living sequence. The heart of that sequence lay in training. The U.S. Navy's flight schools at Pensacola, Corpus Christi, and Hutchinson trained more than 90,000 pilots between 1942 and 1945. Every exercise was standardized, every failure logged, every correction encoded into new manuals. The result was a corps of airmen who operated less as individuals and more as extensions of a doctrine. Their reflexes were data-driven, altitude, angle, release time, all drilled to the point of instinct. "We no longer guess," one instructor said, "we measure." On the Japanese side, pilots were running out not of courage, but of hours. Many of the young flyers sent to defend Okinawa had less than 50 hours of flight experience. Their tactics had devolved into desperation, the rise of Tokutai suicide squadrons, a testament to a system that could no longer replenish itself. The Empire had trained heroes. America had trained process. And process in the modern war was undefeatable. By 1945, the industrial tempo had become almost beautiful in its precision. Tankers left the U.S. West Coast every 3 days, each carrying 140,000 barrels of fuel. Replacement aircraft crossed the Pacific on escort carriers landing at Ulithi and Guam for redistribution. The Pacific had become a factory floor, its conveyor belts made of sea lanes, and its workers wearing flight suits. On any given day, 1 in every 6 American ships was moving supplies, the rest were fighting. When Admiral Nimitz reviewed the reports of the Yamato operation, he circled a single number: sorties lost 10. Beneath it, he wrote replaceable. It was not arrogance, but acknowledgement of the system's maturity. The U.S. war machine had learned to absorb loss without pause. For every ship sunk, 3 were under construction. For every pilot lost, 2 were already training in Texas. Attrition had become calculus. Even nature seemed conquered by schedule. Weather stations in the Aleutians transmitted storm data to fleet meteorologists who adjusted attack routes within hours. Radio decrypt units at Pearl fed intelligence to planners who could reposition entire task forces before dawn. The war was no longer fought by admirals shouting orders, but by algorithms of logistics, handwritten ones calculated on paper, executed by men who trusted the numbers. Far below, in the silence of the East China Sea, the wreck of Yamato lay broken across the seabed. Above it, thousands of ships traced invisible circuits, tankers, carriers, repair barges, the living proof of a truth the Empire had denied, that survival depended not on monument, but on motion. By the time the U.S. fleet turned toward Japan's home waters, the rhythm was unstoppable, a pulse measured in hours, not months. The Americans had discovered the law of the system: redundancy was immortality. Lose 10, replace 20. Burn fuel, deliver fuel. Train, deploy, train again. Somewhere in the dark, beneath 1,000 feet of water, a faint current stirred the silt along Yamato's hull. The oxygen hiss that once marked her heartbeat was gone, replaced by silence. Above, another generation of ships crossed the sea in perfect intervals, the living inheritance of that silence. The ocean, once ruled by giants, now belonged to those who could outlast their own mistakes, those who understood that endurance was not steel, but speed multiplied by learning. When the sea closed over Yamato's final fireball, it did more than bury a ship, it sealed the age of the battleship itself. In that single explosion, the 20th century redrew its laws of power. What had once been the ultimate emblem of industrial might, armor measured in feet, guns that could hurl shells 26 miles, now lay beneath the waves, defeated not by equal strength, but by the invisible calculus of tempo, intelligence, and reach. The war had shown that perfection, when frozen in time, becomes a target. In Tokyo, the news was whispered, not announced. Admirals stared at maps that no longer meant anything, tracing sea routes that no longer existed. To them, Yamato had been more than steel. She was Japan's floating soul. Her loss was not just strategic, it was existential. Survivors who returned to the mainland stepped off trains to quiet streets. There were no parades, only the sound of wind between the ruins of shipyards that had once built gods. She was our prayer in metal, one mechanic said years later, and the ocean refused it. Yet even as she vanished, the lessons she taught began to shape the post-war world. The Americans studied every moment of her destruction. Angles of attack torpedo spread explosion pressure and turned them into blueprints for a new doctrine. The Cold War fleets that followed were born from that transformation. Aircraft carriers replaced dreadnoughts as flagships of power projection. Jet fighters replaced artillery. Intelligence replaced superstition. And at the heart of it all was the principle that destroyed Yamato motion over monument network, over individual. In U.S. naval academies, cadets were taught of the Yamato story not as triumphal myth, but as a parable. The ship's death became a case study in what happens when a system believes it cannot change. Armor is the illusion of control, one lecturer would say, tracing the outline of her hull on a chalkboard. Adaptation is the only defense that matters. In the decades that followed, even the steel that once armored battleships found new purpose, melted down, reshaped into the frames of aircraft bridges and submarines that moved faster and lasted longer than anything Yamato had ever imagined. For Japan, the legacy took a quieter form. In the 1950s, when the country began rebuilding, its engineers carried that lesson into peacetime industry. Shipwrights became automakers. Turbine designers became engineers of civilian infrastructure. Factories once dedicated to war learned to mass-produce not weapons but efficiency. The irony was poetic. The empire that once perished for its devotion to perfection would be reborn through its devotion to process. The same precision that had doomed Yamato became the foundation of Japan's modern identity, disciplined, deliberate, and relentlessly improving. And beneath the East China Sea, she remained a myth made tangible by sonar. Divers who reached the wreck decades later found her in two halves, the bow upright like a tombstone. Her guns still pointed skyward. Around her lay scattered helmets, twisted brass shells, fragments of nameplates. No flag survived. But the silence there was not defeat, it was instruction. She had become a teacher, a monument to the physics of consequence. Each generation of naval officers who studied her came away with the same conclusion. The laws of survival had changed. Quality alone could not guarantee victory. Only systems that learned faster than they broke could endure. It was the law written in the wreck, the law of the system. On the surface, where the currents still shift and shimmer, oil sometimes rises from her hull, a faint iridescent trace that drifts across the waves. Fishermen call it the ship's breath, unaware that it carries fragments of a time when nations believed they could outbuild the future. Above satellites now pass where once her lookouts searched the horizon, and aircraft cut the same sky that once glowed with her burning light. 70 years later, her shadow still lies beneath those coordinates, not as warning, not as relic, but as proof. Proof that greatness without adaptability is extinction. That speed, learning, and connection are the only armor that endures. And if you listen closely beneath the static of the sonar and the rolling tide, there is a faint echo, the memory of an engine room tremor, a whisper of oxygen hiss fading into the endless blue as the sea keeps her secret and time keeps its rhythm.